The last ray of sunshine filtered through the French silk curtains when Clara Ward ordered them to bring the number 196 dress. It was March 1914, and at the Ward mansion in Newport, a 30-year-old woman watched her reflex multiplied in dozens of Venetian mirrors, each surface reflecting a slightly different version of herself, all equally empty. The dress, a dark blue satin-worth creation embroidered with Tahiti pearls, had cost more than an entire house in the city. But to Clara, it was just another armor in her arsenal against the world that had turned her into a living ornament. She remained motionless as three maidens adjusted each fold, each pearl button. His breathing was controlled, almost imperceptible, as if two sudden movements could break the illusion of perfection that so much money could buy. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean hit Rhode Island's rocky cliffs with a violence that brutally contrasted with the sepulchral silence of the room. At that moment, Clara Ward had 200 dresses, 40 skin coats, 300 pairs of shoes, and a jewelry collection valued at more than $2 million of the time. He also had something that money had never been able to buy, such a deep loneliness that he echoed through the marble corridors of his golden prison like the ghost's sorry. If you have already wondered about the true cost of perfection, about the silent price you pay for a life, turned life, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Because some stories can only be told when we understand that beauty is sometimes the cruel of curses. Clara Ward was born Clara Louise Jerome in Detroit, Michigan on June 17, 1873, when golden America only began to find out what meant having too much money. His father, Addison Jerome, was the brother of Jennie Jerome Winston Churchill's mother, and had made a fortune speculating in railroads and real estate investments in the post-World War economic explosion. The richness of the Jerome was neither old nor refined. It was new, bright, and desperately eager for legitimacy. The Jerome family house in East 26th Street, New York, where Clara spent childhood, was an Italian marble palace and Brazilian mahogany that shouted her opulence to anyone passing. Each room was a museum of recent acquisitions, medieval tapestries purchased from impoverished European nobles, paintings of old masters torn from decline aristocratic collections, French furniture that once belonged to Marie Antoinette, or at least that the seller had guaranteed. Clara grew between these objects as a living doll, always dressed in the finest silks and imported lace, her brushed golden hair 100 times every morning by a French housekeeper who spoke to her only in respectful whispers. At the age of 7, she already had a longer wardrobe than most adult women of her time. At 10, his mother, Catherine Jerome, began to take her to charities and social events, where the girl was displayed as a tangible proof of the refinement won by the family. But there was something disturbing to Clara Jerome's perfect. She never cried, never complained, never showed any desire she was not immediately attended by an employee army. It was as if the material abundance had suffocated in it any ability to miss, to wish, to be truly a child. New York society observers began to comment on discreet whispers behind ivory fans, that the girl Jerome had the cold beauty of a porcelain doll, beautiful to contemplate, but unsettling lifeless. Clara's childhood was a meticulous preparation exercise for one purpose: to become the perfect wife for a man of position. She learned piano from a German master, French with an impoverished countess, watercolor painting with a smaller English artist, and dances with a Viennese teacher who swore to have taught Empress Elizabeth herself. Each skill was acquired not for pleasure or passion, but as another tool in its social seduction arsenal. What no one noticed, or perhaps they would rather ignore it, was that Clara absorbed each lesson with a passivity that bordered on despair. She performed every waltz, every sonata, every French conversation with absolute technical perfection, but without a flash of even joy or personal satisfaction. It was as if they were being trained to play the role of itself, and the role required the true, clear Jerome to completely disappear. The American society of the Golden Age functioned as a relentless machine of human transformation. He took young people with personality, desires, and dreams, and shaped them in idealized versions of femininity. Silent, ornamental, eternally arranged to sacrifice. Clara Jerome was being prepared to be the most refined product of this machine, and the process was killing anything she could have been beyond beautiful. Clara Jerome's marriage to Orma Wilson in the fall of 1890, when she was only 17, was treated by the New York press as the social event of the season. Orm was heir to a fortune built in railroads and mining, had a castle in Rhinebeck, and a reputation for bon vivant that made him precisely the kind of man that the mothers of high society wanted for their daughters: rich, well-found, and sufficiently distracted, so as not to interfere with the social life of an ambitious wife. The ceremony at the Episcopal Church of St. Bartholomew was an excess spectacle calculated. Clara wore a Worth dress, made especially for the occasion. 15 meters of ivory satin embroidered with natural pearls and gold wires, a 3-meter tail supported by 6 pageants, and a Belgian lace veil that had belonged to the groom's grandmother. 500 guests watched as she slid down the hall as an ethereal appearance, her beauty so perfect that it seemed almost artificial. But behind the mask of bridal happiness, Clara already showed the first signs of the obsession that would define her adult life. In the weeks preceding the wedding, she ordered 16 dresses for the honeymoon, one for each day traveling around Europe. Each piece was unique, designed specifically for one occasion. In the morning, dresses for the rides in Paris, dresses in the afternoon for the teas in London, dressed at night for dinners in Rome. It was as if she needed a new outfit for each version of herself that she would be forced to represent. The honeymoon revealed the true nature of Wilson marriage. Orm was a kind man, but deeply bored by life and himself. He spent his days hunting, throwing cards, or drinking with other equally rich and equally empty men, making it clear alone to contemplate European landscapes through luxurious hotel windows. She filled time doing shopping, compulsive, obsessive purchases that would become her only form of communication with a world that saw her only as an ornament. In Paris, she discovered the haute couture. Charles Frederick Worth studios were temples of a religion that Clara embraced desperately fervor. There it could be measured, adjusted, transformed into something even closer to the visual perfection that everyone expected from it. Each dress was a work of art, but also an armor. The more elaborate the clothes, the less clear needed to exist under it. The first year of marriage passed as a narcotic dream. Clara and Orm lived between Newport in summer, New York in winter, and Europe in spring, following the social calendar of her class with chronometric accuracy. Clara collected dresses with the dedication of an academic studying old manuscripts. Each piece was catalogued, carefully preserved, used only once in public, and then stored as a relic of a specific moment of his performance as a perfect wife. But the performance began to charge its price. Clara developed increasingly elaborate rituals around her appearance. He got up at 5 a.m. to allow enough time for skincare, hair, the selection of the wardrobe. Its employees received detailed instructions on how each dress should be treated, stored, presented. Wilson's house dress room occupied an entire floor with air-conditioned cabinets, mirrors in every angle, and a team dedicated exclusively to maintaining its collection. Marriage, which should have been the apex of its social existence, turned out to be the beginning of its transformation into something that was no longer entirely human. Clara Wilson was becoming a work of living art, and like all the works of art, her function was to be contemplated, admired, and ultimately possessed by others. Clara Wilson's divorce in 1896 scandalized American high society, not by the separation itself, which was discreetly tolerated among the very rich, but for the way clearly assumed control of their own narrative. She did not withdraw embarrassed or sought a second husband quickly. Instead, he established himself as one of Newport's most powerful and feared women, transforming his newly conquered freedom into a platform, into an even more intense form of self-creation. With the generous divorce agreement, Orm Wilson was too relieved to escape the marriage to compete in the terms. Clara acquired Beechwood, a mansion of 60 Newport rooms that would become the epicenter of her reinvention. The property, built in the style of an Italian palace renaissance, offered the perfect scenario for its growing ambitions. She spent 2 years and a fortune redesigning every room, turning the house into an elaborate theater where she would be simultaneously director, protagonist, and only audience that really mattered. Clara's wardrobe during this time reached proportions that bordered surrealism. She kept contracts with 15 different souriers, Worth in Paris, Lucille in London, Calosseurs for special occasions, Doucet for dresses of day, and received weekly deliveries from New York, London, and Paris. Its orders were so elaborate that European workshops began to reserve entire teams specifically to fulfill Wilson requests. In 1898, Clara organized what the press dubbed the Ball of the Century, a 3-day party in Beechwood that redefined the parameters of high society entertainment. 500 guests were welcomed by Clara, wearing a different dress with each appearance. 18 clothes changes over 3 days, each more stunning than the previous one. The final dress, a Worth creation in purple velvet embroidered with true diamonds that cost more than a house in Manhattan, went into the fashion story as one of the most extravagant pieces ever created. But behind the show, attentive observers began to notice something unsettling about Clara Wilson. She was never seen wearing the same dress twice, no matter how expensive or elaborate. His donations to charity institutions often included virtually new clothes, pieces that cost fortunes, and had been worn for just a few hours. It was as if each dress was contaminated by the experience of being worn, becoming inappropriate for a second presentation. The obsession with constant novelty stretched beyond clothing. Clara was redesigned Beechwood's whole rooms often, as if the familiarity with any environment was unbearable. Employees were instructed to move furniture, exchange curtains, rearrange works of art with monthly regularity. The house has become a constantly changing organism, reflecting the inability of its owner of finding peace in any permanent configuration. The social seasons in Newport followed a rhythm that grew more and more frantic. Clara organized dinners for 40 people twice a week, receptions for 200 people every Saturday, monthly dances that lasted until dawn. For each event, she ordered not only a new dress for herself, but often completely original floral decorations, menus elaborated by European chefs, hired specifically for the occasion, and entertainment, from strings quarters to ballet troupes, imported from New York or Europe. What neither their guests nor the press understood was that all this magnificence was an elaborate form of self-medication. Clara was desperately trying to fill an existential void with material objects, social events, and public admiration. Each new dress was an attempt to discover a version of itself that could feel something beyond the numbness that had become its permanent condition. Clara Wilson's tragedy during her years as Newport Queen was not in the extravagance. It was in the fact that no amount of beauty, luxury, or admiration could touch her part that had been systematically suffocated since childhood. She had become a prisoner of her own perfection, condemned to an infinite search for something that could make her feel real again. The arrival of Prince Joe from Caramanchime to Newport in the summer of 1904 was like the entrance of a fairy tale character in a reality already saturated with fantasy. Young, beautiful, and authentically aristocrats, unlike the new American rich people who dominated Rhode Island society, it represented everything that clearly desired. A life that was not a constant performance, an existence that could have substance beyond appearance. Joe de Caramanchime had a medieval castle in Belgium, a title dating back to the 14th century, and, most important to Clara, an attitude towards money and luxury that was simultaneously natural and indifferent. He wore the same clothes several times without embarrassment, did not know how many rooms were on his ancestral property, and treated family jewelry as casual accessories. For a woman who had spent a lifetime trying to buy social legitimacy, Joe represented the real thing, authentic aristocracy that needed to prove anything to anyone. The procession was discreet by European standards, scandalous by American standards. Joe visited Clara in Beechwood on afternoons when the ocean light filtered through the French windows of the main hall, and the two walked through the elaborate gardens she had ordered to redesign Versailles style. He heard her and art, literature, music, subjects she dominated perfectly, but had never argued with someone who really cared about her opinions. For meetings with Joe, Clara developed an entirely new style. He temporarily abandoned Worth's elaborate dresses in favor of simpler but infinitely more sophisticated creations. Poiré dresses in fluid lines, Art Nouveau jewelry designed specifically for her by René Lalique, less elaborate hairstyles that allowed their natural beauty to transpire. It was as if she were trying to peel the device that had accumulated over the years to reveal something more genuine underneath. The prince seemed fascinated not by the ostentation of Clara, but by the glimpses of the intelligence and sensitivity she kept carefully hidden. He asked her opinion about books, encouraged her to play piano beyond the decorative pieces she had learned in childhood, talked to her about politics and art with seriousness that no one in her American life had never shown. For the first time since childhood, Clara experienced moments when she completely forgot her appearance. The marriage was announced in the fall of 1904, and the international press dealt with the event as a perfect fusion between American money and the European nobility. Clara would be a princess, finally acquiring the title that her wealth had always bought only symbolically. More importantly, it would be free from American society that had transformed it into a living ornament. In Europe, he imagined, he could find out who it was beyond his dresses. The preparations for the wedding reached a level of elaboration that exceeded even the previous standards of Clara. She ordered a complete trousseau of 40 pieces of Charles Frederick Worth each dress, an individual masterpiece that took months to complete. The wedding dress was a fantasy in ivory color and Alençon lace, with a 5-meter embroidered tail with pearls and diamonds and patterns that represented flowers from Beechwood's gardens. But even during the months of preparation, Clara began to show signs that the change she expected could not be as simple as she had imagined. Her orders became even more obsessive, as if she were trying to carry her entire American identity to Europe through her dresses. He asked the couturiers to create 20 versions different from the same model, varying only in minimal details, a slightly different button type, an imperceptibly lighter shade of blue. The disturbing truth was that Clara had become so identified with her collection of dresses that she could not imagine a separate existence of them. Each piece represented not only a specific occasion, but a specific version of itself. Discarding the dresses would be to discard the only versions of Clara Wilson that the world had known and admired. Prince Joe, observing the preparations with growing concern, began to understand that he was not just marrying a woman, but with a living collection of precious objects. Clara had become healer of herself, and he was being incorporated into the collection as another rare and valuable piece. The Caramanchime Castle, erected in the nebulae Colinas of Belgium in the 14th century, should have been the perfect scenario for the transformation of American socialite clearly into European princess. With its Gothic towers, medieval gardens, and lined halls of authentic tapestries, Joe's ancestral property offered something that all Clara's money had never been able to buy: true history, legitimacy that did not need to be performed. But when Clara came to the castle as the new Caraman-Chimay princess in the 1905 winter, she brought 50 dress chests, a team of 12 American employees, and an expectation that her new life would simply be a more refined version of her existence in Newport. The cultural shock was immediate and devastating. The Belgian aristocracy operated according to completely different social codes from those who ruled the high American society. While Clara was used to being the center of attention, always perfectly dressed and constantly admired, found that in Europe, her money and elaborate clothes were seen with a mixture of fun and disdain. The women of the local aristocracy wore family jewelry for centuries, dressed inherited from their grandparents, and treated the obsession of Clara by constant novelty as evidence of social insecurity. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Joe, away from Newport's artificial environment, revealed a much more complex and problematic personality. He drank a lot, disappeared for days in hunting expeditions, and showed a growing indifference to his wife, who had seemed so fascinating when seen through the filter of cultural distance. The castle, which Clara had imagined would be a stage for her reinvention as a European princess, became an even more isolated prison than Beechwood. The social seasons in Brussels and Paris revealed that Clara, despite their title and fortune, remained fundamentally estranged. His attempts to impress with increasingly elaborate dresses were received with cold politeness. His inability to speak fluently French or German, languages that he had learned perfectly in theory but never dominated in social practice, isolated it during dinners and receptions. For the first time in his life, Clara discovered what meant being socially invisible. The answer was predictable. She intensified her purchases. If you could not gain social acceptance in Europe, at least you could maintain your identity as the most well-lined woman on the continent. His requests to the Parisian studios became even more extravagant. Paul Poiret created dresses that were true textile sculptures. Jacques Doucet drew skin coats that combined materials from 4 different continents. Jean Paquin produced such elaborate hats that they required special supports to be transported. But even surrounded by more material beauty than any woman of her generation, Clara began to experience a particular form of despair. Their dresses, which had always worked as emotional armor, lost the power to protect it from the reality of their own insignificance. She could have the most beautiful objects in the world, but she couldn't possess herself. The loneliness in Caraman-Chimay has assumed almost supernatural qualities. Clara wandered through the medieval corridors wearing Worth ball dresses as if they were robbers, their footsteps echoing in empty rooms where Joe's ancestors' portraits observed with expressions that seemed to judge their fundamental inadequacy. She started talking to her dresses, developing intimate relationships with specific pieces of her collection as if they were silent confidants. Princess Clara of Caraman-Chimay found that she had exchanged a golden prison in Newport for an even more golden prison in Europe. But this time, there was not even the illusion that new dresses, new events, or new admiration could fill the void that grew inside it as an emotional tumor. The European aristocracy, with its refined cruelty, had done something that American society had never achieved: to completely expose the vacuity behind all the superficial magnificence that Clara had built around itself. The year 1910 marked the beginning of the definitive collapse of the carefully constructed life of Clara. Joe de Caraman-Chimay, who had gradually become a stranger in his own castle, announced his intention to live permanently on his properties in South Africa, where he had invested in diamond mines. Clara could accompany him, abandoning his dresses, his collection, his whole identity, or staying in the castle as an ornamental princess, maintained by the generosity of a husband who no longer loved her. The choice should have been simple. Any woman with a genuine impulse of self-preservation would have chosen freedom, even if she meant starting with less material luxury. But Clara had become so completely identified with her possessions that the idea of existing without them was literally inconceivable. She chose to stay, becoming a voluntary prisoner of her own collection. The castle, emptied of the male presence that gave him social purpose, became a living mausoleum. Clara kept a routine that was simultaneously meticulous and completely meaningless. He got up every morning at 7, bathed in fragrant water with imported oils from Grasse, and spent 2 hours being dressed by maids who performed their duties with the accuracy of a religious ritual. But for what? There were no dinners to attend, balls to master, admirers to impress. Clara wore the most beautiful dresses in the world to wander alone through empty corridors, contemplating portraits of people killed for centuries. Her meals were served in porcelain of Sèvres, on Belgian linen-covered tables. But she ate alone, in silence, observed only by employees who gradually began to treat her less like a boss and more like a human relic that needed to be preserved. The obsession with dresses reached levels that exceeded any rational definition of behavior. Clara began to order multiple versions of the same model: 10 identical dresses in slightly different shades of blue, 15 equal coats in different skins. When questioned by the couturiers about the need for so much duplication, she simply answered that she needed options. The darker truth was that Clara had lost the ability to make decisions. Confronted with ESC looks between two virtually identical dresses, she went into a state of paralysis that could last hours. Employees reported finding her sitting in front of open cabinets, surrounded by hundreds of options, unable to select a single piece because none seemed suitable for a life that had no more defined purpose. The stations passed without clear notes. Spring, summer, fall, winter, each bringing with it new dresses of Parisian studios, but all equally empty of meaning. She developed increasingly elaborate rituals. She tried 5 different dresses before choosing one for breakfast, changed clothes 3 times in the afternoon for no apparent reason, kept long conversations with her reflection in the mirrors like a different person. Employees began to whisper that the princess was losing reason. She spoke alone for hours, obsessively rearranged her collection of dresses according to criteria that changed daily, first by color, then per season, then a seamstress, then at the time she would never arrive. A few days, she refused to leave the room because no dress looked right to a day that would be the same as all the others. The outer world was still spinning. Europe was walking toward war. American society changed, the fashions changed, but Clara remained frozen in her Belgian castle as a sleeping beauty that would never wake up, surrounded by treasures that had become the jailer of her own soul. The Great War came to Caramanchimay's castle as a distant rumor, then an invasive reality that even wealth could not keep away. Paris studios closed or converted their workshops to military production. The ships that brought tissues from Lyon, silks of How, and pearls of the East were redirected to transport war supplies. For the first time in over 2 decades, Clara faced the terrifying possibility of not receiving new dresses. The reaction was devastating. Without the constant arrival of new pieces for his collection, Clara lost the last wire that connected her to the outside world. His days, which had been structured around the expectation of couturierist deliveries, became completely empty on purpose. She began to wear the same dresses repeatedly, an unthinkable transgression of her own codes, because the choice between known pieces had become unbearable. In 1916, with Joe permanently established in South Africa and the war isolating the Belgium of the rest of Europe, Clara made a decision that scandalized the few acquaintances who still kept in touch with her. He sold part of his collection of dresses to a museum in New York. The transaction was carried out by intermediaries, an absolute secret, because admitting that he needed money would be to recognize that his financial situation was no longer infinitely safe. But money was not really the question. Clara was undoing of herself piece by piece like a woman selling organs to survive. Each dress that came out of the castle carried memories, identities, clear versions that could never exist again. The process was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Each sale made it less overwhelmed by the weight of its possessions, but also less defined as a person. The employees, many of whom had served the family for decades, began from. Some were summoned to the war effort, others simply could no longer support the atmosphere of slow death that permeated the castle. Clara, who had been attended by a team of 20 people, met only 3 maids, too old to leave and too loyal to completely abandon her. Solitude has taken on cosmic proportions. Clara spent whole days without talking to another human being. His meals were left in trays out of his room. His dresses were cared for by silent hands that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. She developed a routine of extreme simplicity. She raised at noon, wearing the first dress she found, a transgression that would have been unthinkable years earlier, and walked through the empty corridors like a ghost in her own life. In 1918, when the Armisticio finally arrived in Europe, Clara had become an almost mythical figure among the few locals who still remembered her. Occasionally seen walking through the abandoned gardens of the castle, always dressed in creations that seemed to belong to an earlier era, it had become a living spectrum of a time that war had definitely destroyed. The ending arrived not with drama, but with a sigh. One cold morning of March 1922, one of the maids found Clara in his dress room, sitting in front of the triple mirror that had reflected 1,000 different versions of herself over the years. She wore a 1898 Worth dress, yellowish by time, opaque pearls and embroidery shredding. His hands were folded on his lap with the same perfection he had kept in life, but his eyes, those eyes that had been described by journalists like liquid saphiras, were finally empty of any need to impress, please, or be seen. Princess Clara of Caramanchimay died as she had lived her last years, alone, surrounded by dresses that no one would see, in a silence that had become her only faithful company. The official cause was recorded as heart failure, but those who met her understood the most subtle truth. She had simply faded, like a thin dress, washed so many times that she lost all the substance. After Clara's death, the inventory of his collection revealed an obsession that surpassed any rational understanding. The lawyers found 1,200 dressed dresses meticulously, each with detailed notes on when it had been worn, which couturier had been created, and what specific occasion it had motivated its order. There were dresses for dinners that never happened, balls that were never organized, trips that were never made. More disturbing than the amount was the discovery that many dresses had never left their original boxes. Clara ordered them, received, admired, and then kept them as if they were sacred relics. Dozens of creations of Worth, Poiret, Doucet remained untouched, their labels still arrested, their protective papers still bent accurately. It was as if she had created a private museum of unquieted possibilities. Among the dresses, the inventors found fragmentary diaries that Clara had kept sporadically over the years. Entries were disturbingly vague, focused almost exclusively on descriptions of clothing and social events, as if their inner life were made up of external surfaces. There were no reflections on personal feelings, relationships, or desires, only detailed lists of fabrics, colors, and occasions. An entrance, dated 1919, revealed with devastating Clara state clearly in his last years, "Today I wore the 1903 blue dress. I remembered the first time I dressed in Newport when I still believed that the next party, the next dress, the next admiration could make me feel something. Now I know that all the dress in the world couldn't wear a soul that never learned to exist for themselves." The auction of Clara's belongings, organized by the executors of his will in 1923, attracted collectors and museums from all over Europe and America. The dresses were sold as historical pieces, representative of an era of ostentation that the war had made impossible to resurrect. Ironically, in death, Clara finally got what she had sought in life. She became truly unforgettable, not as a person, but as a symbol of an obsession that transcended the individual to reveal something fundamental about her time. But the final destination of his collection was deeply melancholy. Dresses that had cost fortunes were sold by fractions of their original values for museums that would display them on anonymous mannequins, or to private collectors that would treat them as historical curiosities. The creations that Clara had commissioned as extensions of her own identity became artifacts of a life that, in retrospect, seemed to have been lived entirely in the third person. Caramanchime Castle was sold by Prince Joe, who returned from South Africa only for legal procedures and left again without visiting the room where Clara had spent her last years. The property was converted to a hotel, and tourists now sleep in rooms where one of the most elegant women of their time slowly defined, suffocated by the very perfection that had taken a lifetime to build. Clara Ward's story reveals a disturbing truth about the feminine condition of her day, and perhaps of all times. It was created, modeled, and polished to be an object of contemplation, a work of living art whose value was entirely the ability to cause admiration in others. But art objects, however beautiful, do not have their own inner life. Clara voluntarily became a prisoner of her own image, believing that external perfection could compensate for internal existential emptiness. Each dress was a desperate attempt to create an identity, but externally created identities are always fragile, dependent on the constant validation of observers who ultimately see only surfaces. His obsession with dresses was not simple vanity. It was a form of communication with a world that reduced it the ornament. When words are missing, when personality is discouraged, when intelligence should be hidden behind decorative smiles, clothing becomes language. Clara spoke through her tissue choices, colors, styles, but she was condemned to speak a language that no one really wanted to listen. Luxury, in his life, revealed himself as the most cruel of illusions. He promised freedom, the freedom to be beautiful, admired, envied. But he delivered only more sophisticated forms of imprisonment. The richer clear it became, the more material options had. The more widely it was unable to choose an authentic version of itself between infinite artificial versions. His death, alone among 1,000 dresses, is a devastating metaphor for the fundamental loneliness of the female condition in a society that values women mainly for their appearance. Clara had everything money could buy, but she could never buy the only thing she really needed: permission to exist as a complete human being with desires, opinions, flaws, and complexities that were valued as much as her beauty. Caramanchime. Princess Clara remains an elegantly dressed warning about the actual cost of superficial perfection. At a time when images still rule lives, where identity is still often built through material possessions, where women still struggle to be seen as more than living decoration, their history resonates with contemporary urgency. She teaches us that having everything and being nothing is the most sophisticated form of poverty. What beauty without substance is a curse disguised as blessing. That silence, when imposed or self-imposed, can be the most violent form of death in life. Clara Ward lived like a porcelain doll in a world of men, beautiful, fragile, and lately tragically broken. His life was a work of art, but art has a price. Eternal immobility, passive contemplation, the fundamental impossibility of being anything beyond what the eyes of others can see. In the end, all the dresses in the world could not cover the existential nudity of a woman who never learned to dress from herself.